Welcome, everyone, to the Sufficiency and Wellbeing Experience, a Sufficiency media podcast about life beyond endless growth and exploitation. I'm your co-host, Vlad Bunea. I am joined today by Fortuny Sicart and Akash Das. We will talk about the Global Justice Report that was put out by the World Inequality Lab. And among other things, Sufficiency Media is the first independent media organization that seeks to promote sufficiency and well-being towards a post-capitalist, decolonized, and intersectional just world. We are collaborators from the minority world and the majority world working together towards a common purpose. We believe a better world is possible. If you can support our work, please visit sufficiencywellbeing.com and join with a paid subscription. This episode is made possible thanks to the generous support of our subscribers. Since we do not take any advertising money, we rely on our readers and listeners to make this work happen. Thank you for your support and solidarity. And now on to the episode. So the World Inequality Lab has put out recently a report called the Global Justice Report. So I would like you to briefly introduce yourselves to the audience, quickly give us your first reactions to the report, and then we'll go into more details. So Akash, you are our first guest. You're new to our audience, so why don't you go first, please?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. It's really it's an honor to be here and speak. Just to give a brief introduction, my name is Akash Das. I've been engaged in policy making and strategic foresight for more than almost a decade now, alongside doing systems thinking and design. I've worked in both private and public sectors. And a lot of my work throughout the many years I've been working in has been about sustainability and climate change and adaptation, specifically identifying risks early on and providing ways in which we can mitigate it, ways we can have both political and systems tools to actually apply in this particular regard. And one of the key things that I've been working on over the last few years and focused on is how do we kind of move towards a post-growth kind of a mindset. How do we build economies that are based around sufficiency, that are based around well-being, and not necessarily only about growth at all costs mindset that we are currently is the predominant architecture in which the economy behaves. Because at the end of the day, that is the root cause that is essential for us to actually focus on. And it's great that we're kind of having that conversation about the Global Justice Report, because it does lay a lot of very I would say a lot of tactical perspectives on how we can achieve sufficiency, how we can achieve, a model shift in which sustainability is possible, while a lot of other populations around the world do not necessarily has to suffer from low productivity. So there seems to be like a lot of thought given to many different perspectives that we'll chat about. But my initial reaction is that it presents a balanced case in many and tries to connect dots from many different angles, whether it's economic, specific, or sociological and ecological perspective. So it seems like, from an overarching bird's eye view, it seems like a balanced way of looking at how sufficiency and well-being can be advanced. I'm also really keen on discussing about some of the numbers that they actually present, the goals that they actually present, but some of those goals might not seem like ambitious or seem like ambitious depending upon which lens you actually look at it. But the underlying structural and the systems change required to actually achieve those would be interesting to actually discuss. So that's me.
Alan, what's your take on the report, your first impressions?
Yeah, I think we need to celebrate the fact that such a mainstream report already goes in line of accepting that the promise of growth are broken, and that we cannot deal with sustainability and social issues without dealing with inequality. So I think this is a very important step, because we don't need to, I would say, keep wasting time on those who defend growth by all means, because they are paid to do it. But I think the general debate is moving more on management, the transition. And I also like the fact that they talk about finance, and they also express how financial institutions are not up for the challenge. And in the last 2 years, I have been actively working in the small company I work as a principal scientist on positive impact driven finance. And we see that it's very, very hard for organizations that are focusing on the things that we actually need, like safe energy, food, housing, and so on, to get the finance required to implement such projects, right? And I think it's very important that we also have or repurpose or rebuild other financial institutions that are not focusing or design uh, to keep up the system as it is or to keep up with development and growth, but to address injustice and to secure the means of living for the whole population internationally. So yeah, I think those are the positive parts that I think we can take on from the report.
Right. I suppose for my take, my impressions that I can summarize in 5 short sentences are that the report is strongly inspired by degrowth, even though it's not specific about it. There's a clear path to reduce the size of the economy, also very important. The proposals in the report are largely financial in nature. It's all about taxation, moving money from the rich to the poor. The report can be seen both as radical and also as conservative. It depends on your lens, how you look at it. And the proposal is realistic from a political perspective. They claim as much, and my impression is that it is feasible from a political perspective. So that's my quick take and first impressions. So why don't we just jump into the subject matter? And for our audience, maybe I would like to give the highlights of the report, which are essentially around 3 top pillars: how this transition can be done towards justice. So they start with the fast decarbonization of the energy systems. Number 2 is they focus on sufficiency, understood as a sharp reduction in labor hours and material footprint and large changes in consumption patterns, food habits, land use, and forest cover. And this is super interesting because they take a very specific approach and definition of sufficiency. And the third pillar for the transformation is a drastic reduction in inequality of income, wealth, and power, both between countries and within them. This is also very interesting in my opinion because, as far as I know, it's the first report that adds a redistribution of power to the mix. So in terms of numbers, a quick summary from at a glance, they say that per capita monthly national income converges to 5,000 euros in every country, which is by the year 2100. And this is closing an existing 16-fold gap that we have today, like a 16 times difference between countries. Coupled with this, in terms of climate change, warming reaches 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2100. And this is instead of over 4 degrees Celsius, keep under current macroeconomic and policy trends. In other words, business as usual. So in a nutshell, this is what the report offers. They unpack each of those 3 sections with concrete policy proposals. We could take turns at reacting to this, or maybe if you want to add more of your takes and more of your data from the report. Akash, let's go back to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think these are, and I echo with your point of views that even though it's not explicitly saying that it's degrowth, it is absolutely that. It is centering its perspectives in post-growth logic, that we have to sort of move from growth at all cost mindset in order for us to be able to achieve it. There's definitely a lot of things that will take place once the implementation process even begins. First and foremost, there's a lot of the report focuses on a lot of structural elements. For instance, you mentioned consumption patterns or shifting consumption patterns. Shifting consumption patterns is extremely embedded in the cultures that we have. So we're not just looking into structures, we're also looking into cultures. And on a cultural level, shifting behaviors looks very different than changing financial tools or implementing policies from a political standpoint. So my focus when I read the report, or when I'm also kind of going back and forth, because a lot of my colleagues, for instance, visited Cannes this year, and it's the biggest marketing and advertising space. And we are still not necessarily talking about how marketing and advertising industries are focused on shifting consumption behaviors, or shifting behaviors from a very planned obsolescence kind of a thought process to a process where sufficiency is even allowed. So we are looking at structural perspectives in the report, but at the same time, I feel like when we go into the implementation stage, there's going to be a lot of psychological, as well as I would say a status quo driven structure that we have in the culture that needs to also be taken into consideration. That's going to be a big barrier that the report doesn't necessarily talk about in depth. And we will get to that once we get into the implementation stage. But I that's one of the key things that I have on my radar in terms of how that is going to create implications as if this report starts functioning on a global platform from a policy standpoint. If that has an uptake, what are some of those barriers that we'll have? So that's what focused on.
Yeah, I'm curious, Akash, and then I'll come back to you, Alan. You mentioned about consumption patterns. They make a lot of proposals that are fiscal in nature, like taxation and a lot of progressive taxation. Do you think, or what is your perception about linking that to changing consumption behaviors? If we implement very steep progressive taxation, like a lot of percentages on very high incomes, like in the tens of millions and billions, etc., will that be enough to create a new pattern of consumption? Therefore, let's say the advertising industry will have to adjust in such a way that they will phase themselves out of existence because they won't have any business to do, because incomes will be compressed, people won't have so much money to spend, therefore no need for consumption, no need for advertising. Does this make sense to you? Can you make this connection?
On an overarching point of view, yes. Highly, highly ambitious from the standpoint of how consumer markets tend to behave. Because what I do feel is that while marketing and advertising have been large contributors to driving consumption patterns that are unsustainable, at the end of the day, it is also linked with a lot of the industries that we currently have, from technological sector to food sector, to beauty sector, to lifestyle. And there's a lot of, the luxury sector, for that instance, are all linked together. So while we can initiate fiscal structures to create a downstream impact, and that downstream impact is also going to play a role into shifting consumer behaviors, what will be interesting to see is what happens in the meantime, like the transition space between enacting a financial policy and creating that sort of a top-down, sort of a pressure-based system of changing consumer behaviors. What really happens in the transition space? What kind of a protective layers are we going to have for a lot of startups that are going to be going out of business? A lot of design or a lot of marketing firms are going to go out of business. So my point of view is that going to create more layoffs? Is that going to be creating a lot of people who are going to be out from jobs? So what do we do to kind of protect that kind of a system? Because yes, you're absolutely right that advertising and marketing will have to phase out, will have to kind of shift their thinking into creating this, but this is going to require 100-year shift being compressed into maybe the kind of time frame that we're looking at from the report, at least within like 20 to 30 years. As somebody who kind of thinks from a policy angle, but also a little bit from like what are going to be the implications on the ground, because like we're seeing AI happening right now, and that's creating a lot of chaos. So how do we kind of minimize the chaos that it might bring? Definitely an ambitious goal that you mentioned, and then the report mentions in terms of creating fiscal tools that can actually create like a top-down consumer behavior shift is going to be helpful. It's going to create a momentum that can take us closer to sufficiency, but at what cost? And
Right.
within that what cost question is also, will there be winners and losers while the transition is happening? That's something that we have to be aware about.
Alam, back to you. I'm curious if you have some favorite numbers from the report, or if you want to talk about more about work time reduction as an answer to what Akash mentioned. Is that feasible? Do you link it with sufficiency?
Yeah, I was trying to build on Akash's response, and also based on what you are saying now with work time reduction. The complexity of the transformation is that we need to touch so many levers at the same time, right? So, for example, we cannot reduce consumption or reduce the metabolism of the economy overall without securing the means of life for everyone, right? Without securing that everyone has access to the basics, no? And we have a system that is very good at providing a lot of abundance of superfluous stuff, entertainment, addictive content, unhealthy foods, and so on, right? But the very basic thing that we need, low carbon energy, nutritious foods, and so on, are either too expensive or not provided to everyone, right? I think it's very important to explain very well to people who will be affected by that, even people who already are quite privileged, that taxation, first of all, it will affect inflation, because we are competing with the rich. We are not competing with migrants or the poor. We are competing with the rich. The new taxation will make taxation fair. Wealth reduction will be good for our democracies, will push inflation down, and it will give essential resources to bring back wealth to the public sector, which I think it should be more explicit in the document, which we had been lost worldwide, including China, have been losing public wealth in the last 40 years. Every single country, UK, for example, is a dramatic case to negative wealth or public wealth, while it used to own a significant part of the economy just some decades ago before Margaret Thatcher. So also, I think it's very important to tell people that this is not a new wave of taxation for very small entrepreneurs and people who are paying very high labor taxes everywhere and being taxed for things that should not be taxed, but rather taxing wealth, rentism, and people who are actually not working, but getting a lot of money just because they have the capital or the means of production. So I think this is very important to say, because we need to gain public wealth through taxing wealth, which will allow us to reinforce public services, which are very in danger right now. So public services will bring affordability. Affordability require people to earn less money, and then they can afford work time reduction. We need to go through that sequence, because if we just tell people work time reduction, the people who will be able to afford it are the people on the top of the income distribution. The people who are exploited and at the edge will suffer. And we see housing, renting exploding worldwide, and we cannot cut hours without dealing with rentism and wealth. And I think it's very good that the report put it, but I think we also need to make it very clear that they go together.
Absolutely. And since we were talking about taxes and money, the report proposes a progressive scheme for the taxation of both wealth and income. It would be interesting to say some numbers on this topic. So in terms of wealth, and this is like a global wealth tax, very important. So these wealth taxes will fund a global justice fund, an institutional global way of moving money around in the world. So this money will go into that global fund, which in turn will pay country dividends. So the citizens of the world will receive equal per capita dividends from this global justice fund. And this is very interesting and egalitarian in spirit. And at the same time, the global justice fund will have its own investments through a world sovereign fund. This is the innovation in the report. How will this fund be funded? Wealth taxes starts at 1% at roughly $2 million and goes all the way up to 20% for wealth above $553 million. So that's the pyramid of taxation progressively for wealth. And in terms of income, and this is again a global income tax, starts at 5% for income above 200,000 euros. And the maximum is 90% of all income above 106 million euros. And this is personal annual income. This is where the money will come from. And it's very important to note these global taxes are on top of the national taxes that each country has. This works on top of that. And one of their main functions is to act as a redistributive and also as a reparative mechanism for inequality, but also for historical injustices that come from colonial times. This is super interesting and innovative about the report. And they mention how these money should be allocated for each country. So again, it's on a per capita basis. And the destination for these distributions would be primarily in education and healthcare. So those two public expenditures are meant to replace the material side of the economy. So this is how they suggest the dematerialization will happen by shifting the productive economy towards a service economy around healthcare and education. And they suggest a multiplication of investments in these sectors by orders of magnitude more than what we have today. So 3, 4, 7 times more than what countries spend on education and healthcare. This is super important, and I think it links to how work time reduction can happen, since we won't have to work that much in a productive capacity. So these were some of the new numbers that I found interesting from the report. Akash, you mentioned you had more interesting numbers to tell us from the report. Would you like to share those and your reaction and how it fits in a global picture?
Yeah, for me, I think it's alongside the numbers that you mentioned, I think the key numbers that were really interesting to me about were the convergence per month numbers, which is like by 2100, the report expects that every country converges to 5,000 euro per month per capita national income, which is really interesting. I really like that sort of the way the report kind of specifies that based on the different purchasing powers that the countries currently have, the 16-fold gap that they have shown between the countries that are currently at the lowest ends of the spectrum versus at the highest ends of the spectrum. I think it provides a very, very clear picture about the fact that achieving this kind of a sufficiency, which is a good for all scenario, is very much possible, and it's very much very much something that cannot happen because we have a lot of global north countries that are exactly where the 5,000 euro mark sits. North American per capita currently sits around 4960 or something, if I'm not wrong. That's what the report says. So we are very close to that. The developed countries and the advanced economies are very close to that particular number. What we're actually looking at is pulling up the countries and the economies that are not yet able to scale and not yet able to find a way to get there. The biggest pushback obviously is going to be from the advanced economies when we are going to ask or expect them to kind of have again, like it's not really policy matters, financial taxation systems and tools matter a lot, but I think eventually the biggest barrier is going to be the mindset shift. I mean, is there going to be enough political will? Is there going to be enough willingness to actually adapt and adopt these kind of methods? Coming back to again behavioral mechanics. So those are things that are going to be probably a difficult thing. But to me, I think these are the numbers from the report that connect deeply with me, because I feel like it clearly showcases that we're not asking for degrowth from the way it is usually misunderstood or intentionally created around a misunderstanding is that we're asking for countries to reduce their material throughput. What we're asking for the advanced economies is that create more of a steady state system as opposed to creating a drastic decline in material throughput or quality of life. The quality of life just needs to be redistributed in a way that is good for everybody, not necessarily asking people to get poorer. So I think that's my take
Right.
on numbers.
Yes. Alan, do you think this global justice fund is ambitious enough?
Good that you asked, because I was gonna add an interesting number that by 2100, the public debt with respect to GDP will still be 90%. I think we need to understand how this public debt is created, right? Because at least the way I understand money is that this is a public good, right? It's a relationship. It has as much value as our relations allow to be. It doesn't have inherent value. And we should not pay private financial institutions to create money, right? Because there have to be a public monopoly to do that. If they develop a project, if they are taking risk, if they are creating social and environmental value, and they should get paid for that, right? But not just for create money, which is the most common case, right? So private through credit create money, which they also decide what is the cost of how reliable is our governments to give it back. And then it impoverishes us, right? And they also buy whenever they can, as much as they can, public wealth, right? So as I was telling before, they have been historically privatization at the end, it's public wealth extraction. It's not austerity, it's not efficiency, it's just taking wealth from that was built with the public and bring it to the private. So this is very problematic because for me, instead of saying we need to change the way we create debt and we need to change who gets rewarded for holding debt, public debt, and also we should reevaluate and consider which debts are legitimate. Mm-hmm. What the report essentially says is we will ensure that countries who are already very tensioned, from core countries through international debt, they will get reparations. So the way they alleviate this is through trade, which we know is very unjust because the current relations of power, and through reparations, which is money that they should have from the very beginning, right? So I think the framework is ex post justice. And I'm more in favor to say, okay, now that we are approaching a big transformation, let's change the way public debt is created, how we handle with money. Let's review which debts are legitimate. Let's eradicate debts that have gone to dictators and people who did not benefit. So take it from their people. And reparations is not a way to give back the money that was stolen to people, that are going to be stolen to people again, as we saw in the report, but rather for the money that till today has been taken away from them through reproduced debt and through unfair trade and expropriation. So in that regard, I'm quite critical, because this is an opportunity to say most of the debt in the global south is unfair and should be reviewed. Reparations is not the mechanism to solve that. We need to change debt creation.
Right. So do you think the Global Justice Fund in its design goes far enough to fill in this role of global justice? And the way they suggest the creation of a United Nations Central Bank and United Nations currency to replace the hegemony of the dollar as mechanisms for restorative and reparative justice, they mean it in that way. But do you think they go far enough? Because that would be my question, actually, for you both. And number two, they also suggest that these new institutions will be able to issue debt. Now, I have my reservations about that policy. Is that necessary to issue debt to fund the new institutions? And if it is necessary, will be used for the good purpose. So what do you both think about this? Let's go back to you, Alan, first, since you were on this topic, and then we'll go to you, Akash.
I mean, the short answer is no, because what I'm mentioning, right? This is an opportunity to change who do we reward and which cycles of debt we are creation, right? Because what we are seeing is an economy where the biggest predictor of your wealth is how much capital you have. Mm-hmm. It's not how innovative you are. It's not how hard you work. It's your family wealth or your actual wealth. And this is a failure of finance, right? Because in a fair system, your future income will depend, of course, on whether you have a solid social state behind you, but it should be based on the work you do, right? Not your background or how much capital you hold. In no way this is fixing that. And it's good that there is, for me, it's good that there is an alternative to get access to credit, which is not abusive, right? Or doesn't follow the criteria of private markets. That will push the pressure of debt down, like it would in housing. So I think it's good, but it doesn't solve the injustice, the historical injustice of the current amounts of debt, right? So moving forward, yes. And I think if there is good democratic scrutiny, that should be the case. We should be creating debt to finance the transition. But I would say we also need to clear up the very heavy back that many countries and the working class in many countries have because of reproduced debt.
So Akash, I'll change the question for you a little bit, because Alan raised some good points. And I have in mind their proposal for the country dividends, which this Global Justice Fund will pay. And they are meant to be on an equal per capita basis for all citizens in the world. They mean it in this way as an egalitarian and repetitive mechanism for what Alan just mentioned, right? So every citizen of the world will receive, well, it's not in their pockets. Their governments will receive those money on a equal per capita basis for healthcare, climate, and education investments, right? So the authors of reports say this is our answer to Alan's concerns, in which we try to do some reparations, right? But they do not exclude the possibility that on an individual basis, countries should also do an additional reparative mechanism. Like, for example, France should pay back all the money that they took from Haiti for slavery, so-called reparations, right? And many other examples. So it does not exclude that. What do you think, Akash, about the country dividends suggested in the report as a mechanism for egalitarian justice and reparative mechanism? Are they good enough?
From a planning perspective, it shows a possible way for us to do it. Mm-hmm. The way that is going to be done, I feel that's the area that the report has not really gone too deep into it, because like in terms of like what would be the implications of from the point of view of reparations. Like reparations is not a new topic. Like we see that conversation coming up in COP, in other United Nations convenings quite repeatedly, and we've not been able to sort of reach an agreement. That's kind of like fundamentally, to me, I feel like yes, absolutely. The way the report talks about the dividends, the way the report has kind of created a sort of a structural system in which the wealth flows, and thereby creates a vehicle for creating the sufficiency model, seems like has merit. But what would be the institutional and the political structures that would be required to actually make sure that this does follow through? What are we doing to kind of create that create a leverage for companies and for politicians and for institutions to actually follow through with this. Those are things that my brain continues to go back to. In terms of like creating the dividends from a purely from the lens of thinking about it strategically, I think it has value. We will have to again go back to, and I absolutely agree with the points that Alan raised, because you have to factor in the fact that there is additional debt that is already there, which is going to be creating a force, which is going to continue being a pressure. And how do we kind of offload that pressure alongside the dividends itself? So the dividends provide a future perspective in terms of how do we allow for this particular goals that are set in the report to actually take place. But what are some of those principles and structures in place already, or some of those pressures that are placed already? How do we kind of offload them? Whether that happens through reparations, whether that happens through other mechanisms, remains to be solved. But I think the dividends show part of the picture, not the whole picture. The whole picture is taking into consideration the weight of the past as well, not just the pull of the future and the present. So we have to kind of take those things into consideration in order to kind of create a holistic sort of a map, holistic roadmap. And then comes, of course, if we have not been able to be successful at coming to a unanimous standing on reparations so far, what are we missing really? Is it really tactics and tools and frameworks, or is it a lack of negotiation, a lack of ability to actually pull advanced economies to understand the rationale behind reparations? Or there are other barriers? Debt is a huge barrier for even advanced economies, for that matter. So what are some of those barriers? How can we identify them in time and figure out a way to remove them so that negotiations and solidarity can happen for reparations and these discussions to happen? Because I imagine that these issues will crop up when we are trying to discuss building this format or this framework and implementing it as well. So we have to kind of face it. Yeah.
Yes, and on this note, folks, this is our first half hour of our conversation about the Global Justice Report. Join us in the second part of this conversation for our paid subscribers. See you soon.